Fuel prices have been through the roof lately. A gallon of diesel at the pump today costs more than $3. That's up almost 80% from a low of $1.87 in April of last year. Thanks, Joe Biden, right? Well, maybe not. Joe Biden is no friend of the oil industry. In only his first month of office, he halted construction of the XL pipeline, he issued a moratorium on new oil and gas leases on federal lands, and he antagonized one of the world's dominant oil producers by publishing a previously classified report blaming Saudi Arabian leader Mohammed bin Salman for the murder of American journalist Jamal Khashoggi. But as it turns out, Biden and his policies, whatever you think of them, have very little, if anything, to do with what you're paying for diesel right now at the pump. There's a lot of misinformation and even more misunderstanding about what does and doesn't affect fuel prices. So now seemed like a pretty good time to take a deep dive into what really affects fuel prices. In this episode, we'll be looking at fuel prices over the past few years and break out the major elements that go into determining the price you pay at the pump. Let's start with a little context. Looking at diesel prices over the last 5 years, you can see that prices have been hovering just under $3 for most of that time. If you were to look back even further, $3 a gallon plus or minus has been the benchmark for diesel for more than 15 years. And while it's tempting to look at who was president when prices were high and when they were low and assign credit or blame, the fact is that fuel prices rise when the global economy is booming and fall during economic downturns. It's supply and demand. And if you look at what the economy was doing instead of who was president, you're going to be able to budget better going forward. I think we can all look back at 2020 and say with some certainty that diesel prices weren't low because of some politician. They were low because of the global pandemic. And while they're higher now, they're really closer to normal, and I'd point out that freight rates during that same period have increased even more, touching off an avalanche of new applications for operating authorities. But that's a story for another day. The price of diesel is based on the market price of oil, and the market price of oil is determined, on paper at least, by the buyers and sellers of oil futures on the New York Mercantile Exchange, or NYMEX. This price is determined by the current supply of crude oil worldwide and the demand for that oil at refineries. An oil futures contract is 1,000 barrels with guaranteed delivery on a certain date. Anyone holding a mature contract must be prepared to accept delivery in actual barrels of oil, which is why the market price of oil will drop in times of slow demand, when refineries reduce production capacity and investors are forced to unload their contracts for whatever they can get, to avoid having to actually have an oil tanker pull into the port of New York and New Jersey with their name on the invoice. In 2020, when the global economy went into lockdown, there was a brief period of time when traders had to pay refiners to take oil contracts off their hands. Refiners still had to be paid for refining the fuel, and there was still a cost for marketing and distribution, including what the retailers make, which is typically only pennies per gallon. And then there were federal, state, and local taxes to be paid, but all of these other expenses collectively account for only about half of the regular pump price. So when diesel was selling briefly for less than $2 a gallon, it's safe to assume that that really represents the rock bottom for fuel prices back when the cost of a barrel was $0 or less. Conversely, prices right now may be exceptionally high, with both refineries and distribution networks scrambling to meet rapidly growing demand in a post-quarantine economy. This is a super simplified overview to maybe hopefully paint the big picture of how this process works and why political actions that might affect future demand are really not why there have been increases at the pump. In our next segment, we're going to talk to John Kingston, editor-at-large and oil futures expert at FreightWaves, who will explain how all this works in more detail. For the Truck Boss Show, I'm Brad Kuhn, and I'll see you down the road.